Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Benjamin Paz Wash Processed Honduras from Frukt Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Frukt, based out of Turku, Finland. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel one time before. And before we start discussing this coffee, I wanted to talk about that previous review, as if there's one review that I wish I could go back and adjust, it would be that previous Frukt review. And the main reason for that is about a week after we posted that review, I went back and tried that coffee one more time, and I was really impressed with the way it opened up after an extended period of rest. Ever since then, I've wanted to go back and review another one of Frukt's coffees, and this is that perfect opportunity to do so. So I'm looking forward to discussing this coffee, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, Frukt is definitely on the lighter side of coffees just in general. This one felt on the more developed side of things that they do. So I feel like the best descriptor for this is a more developed Nordic light for the roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 26, first impression, and the cup yielded an interesting brightness right at the forefront, but the aspect that really captivated this cup on this first try was this almost nougat-like quality. That was complemented by a lot of other candy bar-like attributes, most distinctly thinking about this chocolate, caramel, and nutty aspect that all put together kind of reminded me a little bit of a Snickers. So it very much reminded me of a Snickers from that first try with an interesting bright acidity. As a result, it was an interesting first cup. So we proceeded from there on day 28 with the Chemex. And what I found from the Chemex was it kind of highlighted and accentuated a lot of the more bright apple attributes to this coffee, as the apple acidity was really a lot more prominent and present on this day. In addition to that, I was getting a little bit more of this kind of citric bitterness that was very much in line with the listed grapefruit that they have here. It does cool off into a slightly nutty finish, so it did have a little bit of that previous candy bar-like attributes to it. However, it seems to focus a little bit more on the other side of this coffee. Day 30, brewed it through the April dripper, as we continue to work with the April dripper, and it came out interestingly more vibrant in another unique sense, as the brighter acidic attributes are again at the forefront before settling off into that somewhat candy bar nougat-like aspect to it. Just a lot more brightness in general, a lot more of the acidity. So not necessarily the way I wanted this coffee to go. Well, we continue on to day 31 as we brewed it with Frukt's recipe, and it came out a little bit more slight at the forefront and bright on the back end. So those previous, a little bit more pronounced chocolate bar-like characteristics were more tame in general, and the acidity really seemed to be in much more abundance as the citric bitterness came out very strong. So this one just felt a little bit more bitter, and again, not necessarily what I wanted from this coffee, just a lot more strong in the finish too, as the acidity really seemed to ramp up. So my least favorite day of this coffee. Day 32, back to our original recipe, and it was at its best yet again, as it continued to remain reminiscent of a Snickers, with this nougat-like aspect being one of the more pronounced characteristics to it. Brightness yet again on the back end. I really like the way that it was structured in this sense, because you got this really interesting candy bar-like cup, and then on the back end you got the bright acidity yet again reminiscent of our previous experiences. Day 34, the cup has finally started to reach a little bit of consistency, as settling on this recipe, which again, very standard recipe, really seemed to accentuate a lot of the candy bar-like attributes on the forefront, with the brightness being on the back end. But what I really pulled out from this day was the brightness really started to open up, so I was getting a lot more of it. The acidity seemed to be a little bit more strong, the apple aspects to it, the citric aspects to it, a lot more pronounced. And on day 36, that would continue again, as I'm starting to see the brightness seep into the forefront of the cup as well, as the citrus continues to remain reminiscent of the grapefruit. And I think that's what they're going for on the grapefruit. I've said before, when grapefruit notes are on bags of coffee, I typically either find them to be very fresh fruit, or I find them to be slightly bitter. And in this case, it seems to be the slightly bitter side of things. Let's see here, a tart, bright acidity is in the cup in this kind of lingering finish. So there's an extra layer of complexity to it, and I think that that's the green apple that they have listed in here very much coming into play. Day 38, the cup continues to trend in that direction, so it's really starting to skew a lot more on that bright acidity, and I think maybe that's what this coffee was going for, because I've heard some people describe it as Kenyan-like. Pretty acidic citric bitter with much more of that candy bar sweetness, now a secondary component. There's a little bit of this herbal component, which reminds me a little bit of Kenyan coffees. In addition to that, the chocolate and nutty aspects are still present, a little bit more slight and less noticeable than the other parts of this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And there are a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. The cleanliness, level 4, yeah, it's a very clean cup of coffee. I don't think that there was any question about that ever. Even if this can be a little complex and you can get some extras to it, at the end of the day, it was just a clean cup in general. Finish, level 4, yes, I've been kind of discussing the bright acidic finish to the cup, but even then it just kind of remains at a decent level. It's not overbearing. It's not overly heavy. It just kind of like finishes a little bit more clean and even. Sweetness, level 4. Yeah, I would say it's just about that level 4 mark. I'm kind of thinking as to whether I would bump that down. It's just kind of very much there at that even level 4 mark. Mostly the candy sweetness that I was getting. The fruit sweetness, not as much. I don't think I was getting as much of the fruit sweetness as opposed to that kind of chocolate bar sweetness to it. So there, the level 4 seems good for me. The acidity, level 4, it's on the slightly higher side of that level 4 mark, as the acidity very much reminded me of Kenyan coffees. That was probably the biggest, most interesting part of this coffee. So the acidity a little bit more abundant than the sweetness for me. Citrus fruit, level 4, typically I like to lump the apple into that category, but in addition to that, that kind of bitter citrus that was coming from the cup was pretty consistent, no matter how it was brewed or when it was brewed. There were just times where it was a little bit more pronounced and prominent than other times, and that's where the chocolate comes into play, because that was the, at times, most dominant characteristic for me. So those two right there, and that's why they're both at that level 4 mark. But a lot of the candy components to it, hence why the citrus is also, the caramel is also at a level 3, because that also does kind of go in line with that chocolate bar-like sweetness. Let's see here, a bunch of level 3s too. So, wow, there's a lot to discuss on this tasting wheel. The body level 3, yeah, I feel like that's about right. I feel like maybe you can kind of push that on the higher side of things, especially with the V60 brew method, but for the most part, I think that's about right. Florality, level 3. Yeah, I could see that. They're probably the lower side of that level 3, honestly, but there's a fair bit of florality in it. Spice, there are a lot of things in this coffee. That's what's so interesting about it. Spice, yeah, the kind of herbal aspect to this coffee, the kind of Kenyan-like herbality within this coffee, I could definitely see that there. That's why the savoriness is also at a level 3. It's not necessarily like a tomato savoriness, but kind of like this savory spice to the coffee, like a baker's spice. Bitterness, as I kind of mentioned, level 3, that's all the citrus, and the citrus can be a little bitter in this coffee at times too, so I like it there. Slight bit of smokiness to it as well. I feel like I've gone through everything in this tasting wheel for the most part, with the exception of the stone fruit, because there's none of that in there. Mostly because there's a lot of depth and complexity to this coffee in general. So even though at times it can seem like maybe it's slightly one-dimensional, this coffee had so many attributes within this tasting wheel that it definitely left it a little bit more complex of a cup in general. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I thought it was good. And this goes to show yet again that I actually quite like the way that Frukt does their coffee. In terms of luring coffee roasters, I think that they're one of the ones I enjoy a little bit more, especially relative to that part of the world. I think that Coffee Collective is the only other one I can think of that I'm like, I really enjoy what they're doing with the luring. But other than that, I think kind of focusing and accentuating the acidity, which is what a lot of luring-based coffee roasters do, isn't necessarily going to be the biggest selling point to me, and that's always going to be a detracting factor when it's a little bit more abundant than the sweetness. The fact that it kind of reminded me in a sense of the Kenyans I don't necessarily like was also a little bit of a sticking point, but what I really appreciated about this coffee was the depth and complexity to it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, that one's a little tricky. If you like the citrus, I think that this one really had that in significant abundance. I don't want to undersell how much I was able to get this reminiscent chocolate bar-like aspect, because that was by far my favorite thing. I really do enjoy when coffees kind of taste like that. And if you kind of work with it the way I did and really try to focus and bring that out in the cup the most, then that can be a really nice selling point to you, because it was to me as well. But probably what this coffee is going for is a lot more of the bright attributes, the acidic apple, the acidic citrus, because that right there is at the most forefront of this coffee, especially with a little bit of time. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Benjamin Paz wash processed Honduras from Frukt Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.